Page 177. A greenish Arctic moisture has to replace the warm blood inside you. Only then can you command sex. And right then, during those very days, they started to bring from the Ch6, the penalty isolator, to the clay pit as the heaviest work of all, a penalty brigade, a group of thieves who just a bit earlier had almost cut the throat of the camp chief. They had not wanted to cut his throat, but because they were not such fools as that, but to frighten him, so he would send them back to Krasnaya Presnya. They recognized Novi Jerusalem as a deadly place where you'd never get enough to eat. They were brought in at the end of my shift. They lay down in the clay pit in a sheltered spot, bared their short, thick arms and legs, their fat tattooed stomachs and chests, and lay there sunning themselves, content to be out of the wet cellar of the penalty isolator. I went up to them in my military attire and properly proposed that they set to work. The sun put them in a benign mood, and therefore they only laughed and sent me to the well-known to the well-known mother. I was enraged and confused and departed empty-handed. In the army, I would have begun with the order, "Stand up," but here it is quite clear that if any of them did stand up, it would be solely to stick a knife in my ribs. And while I was cudgeling my brains over what to do, after all the rest of the clay pit was watching and might also quit work, my shift came to an end. Only thanks to this circumstance am I here today to write this study of the archipelago. I was replaced by Akimov. The thieves continued to lie there, sunning themselves. He gave them one order. The second time he shouted a command at them, maybe even stand up. And he shouted, and the third time he threatened them with the camp chief. And they chased him, and in a low spot in the clay pit, knocked him down and smashed him in the kidneys with a crowbar. He was taken directly from the factory to the provincial prison hospital, and this brought his career as a commander to an end, and maybe his prison sentence, and maybe his life. In all probability, the director had appointed us as dummies to be beaten up by these thieves. My own short career at the clay pit lasted several days longer than Akimov's, but brought me not the satisfaction I had expected. Only a constant spiritual depression. At 6 a.m., I entered the working compound, more deeply despondent than if I had been going there to dig the clay myself. I wandered around the clay pit like one quite lost, hating both it and my own role in it. From the wet pressing mill to the clay pit, there was a trolley track at the spot where the level area ended, and its rails dipped into the workings. A windlass stood on the platform. This motor-driven windlass was one of the few miracles of mechanization in the whole brickyard. Along the entire line from the clay pit to the windlass, and from the windlass back to the pressing mill, the sloggers had to push the cars loaded with clay. Only on the rise out of the clay pits were the cars dragged up by the windlass. The clay The clay pit occupied a distant corner of the brickyard compound, and it was a surface plowed by cave-ins, the cave-ins branching off in all directions like ravines, leaving between them untouched prominences. The clay lay right up to the surface, and the stratum was not thin. One could probably have mined it deep down or else across its width continuously, but no one knew how it should be done, and no one made a plan for mining it. It was all managed by the brigadier of the morning shift, Baranov, a cocky young Muscovite, a non-political offender with a pretty face. Baranov worked the clay pit simply where it was most convenient. He excavated where the most clay could be dug for the least work. He never went too deep, so the cars wouldn't have to be pushed up too steep a slope. Properly speaking, Baranov was in charge of all 18 to 20 men who worked during my shift in the clay pit. He was the only genuine boss of shift. He knew the lads. He fed them. In other words, got for them big rations, and each day wisely decided himself how many cars of clay were to be delivered, so that there would neither be too few nor too many. I liked Baranov, and if I had been somewhere in prison with him as a bunk neighbor, we would have got along very gaily, and we would have got along right here too. I should have gone to him and had a big laugh with him over the fact that the director had appointed me to the position of intermediate watchdog, which I understood nothing. But my officer's training did not permit me this, and I tried to maintain a severe bearing with him, and to get him to knuckle under. Excuse me. Though not only I, and not only he, but the entire brigade could see that I was as much of a useless meddler as a district party instructor during the crop sowing. It made Baranov angry that they installed a stuffed shirt over him, and more than once he mocked me cleverly in front of the brigade. In the case of anything I considered necessary to do, he immediately proved to me that it was impossible. On the other hand, loudly shouting, "Foreman, foreman," he would on occasion summon me to various corners of the clay pit and ask me for instructions, how to take up the old trolley tracks and lay new ones again, how a wheel that had jumped off the axle should be put back again, and what to do with the allegedly non-functioning windlass, or where the shovels should be taken to be sharpened. Already weakened from day to day in my impulse to command in the face of his ridicule, I was then quite happy if he simply ordered the fellows to dig that morning. He didn't always do it, and did not annoy me with his vexatious questions. Therefore, I kept out of his way quietly and hid from my subordinate semi-chiefs behind the high piles of earth that had been carted away, set myself down on the ground and sat there, stock still with a sinking heart. My spirit was numb from my first few days in camp. Oh, this was not prison. Prison has wings. Prison is a treasure house of thought. It was gay and easy to starve and argue in prison. And just try that here. 10 years of starvation, work, and silence. Just try it. The iron caterpillar track was already dragging me to the grinder. I was helpless. I didn't know it. But I wanted to slip off to one side, to catch my breath, to come to myself, to lift my head and to see. Over there, beyond the barbed wire, across the vale, was a knoll. On it was a little village, 10 houses. The rising sun illuminated it with its peaceful rays, so close to us, and and the very opposite of a camp, for that matter too. It too was a camp, but one forgets that for a long time there was no motion at all there. But then a woman walked by with a pail, and a tiny child ran across the weeds in the street. A cock crowed and a cow mooed. Excuse me. And there in the clay pit we could hear everything perfectly. And a mongrel barked, and what a lovely voice too. It was not a convoy's dog. And from every sound there, and from the very immobility itself, a holy peace flooded into my soul. And I know for certain that if they should say to me that very moment, "That's your freedom, just live in that village until your death, renounce your convictions, renounce cities and the vanities of this world, your passing fancies, your convictions, the truth, renounce it all and live in that village." But not as a collective farmer. Look at the sun every morning and hearken to the roosters. Are you willing? Oh, not only willing, but, good Lord, please send me to a life like that. I felt I would be unable to last out in camp. On the other side of the brickyard, invisible to me, and the moment a passenger train roared by on the Rizhev line. In the clay pit they shouted, "The trustees' train." Every train was familiar. They kept time by them. The trustees' train passed by at 9:15, and at 9 o'clock, separately, not at shift-changing time, they would conduct the trustees from the camp to the brickyard. The official employees and those in positions of responsibility. The famous train was at 1:30, the provider, which we soon went to line up and have lunch, and to lunch. My Zek supervisor, Olga Petrovna Matronina, was brought to work along with the trustees, and sometimes, if her heart was anxious about the work, even earlier by the special convoy. I sighed, came out of my hiding place, and went along the clay pit trolley track to the wet pressing factory to report. The entire brickyard consisted of 2 plants, for wet pressing and dry pressing. Our clay pit worked only for wet pressing plant, and the chief of the wet pressing was Matronina, an engineer specialist in silicate. What kind of an engineer was she, I do not know, but she was fussy and stubborn. She was one of those unshakable loyalists, an orthodox communist, of whom I had already encountered a few in the cells. There were not many of them in general, on whose mountain peak, however, I myself could not cling on the basis of the letter section. Ch6, as a member of the family of one shot, she had received 8 years from an OSO, State Security, and right now she was serving out her last months. True, they had not released any politicals throughout the war, and she too would be held until the notorious special decree, but even that did not cast a shadow on her state of mind. She served the party, and it was unimportant whether in freedom or in camp. She was from a reserve for rare animals. In camp, she tied a red scarf around her head, and only a red scarf. Even though she was already over 40. Not one girl in camp wore a scarf like that in the brickyard, and not one free Komsomol girl did either. She bore no grudge for her husband's execution, nor for her own 8 years' imprisonment. All of these justices had been carried out, had been caused, in her opinion, by individual Yagoda henchmen under the Comrade Beria. The only arrests being made were just. Seeing me in the uniform of a Soviet officer, she said at our first meeting, "Those who arrested me can now see the proofs of my orthodoxy." Not long before she had written a letter to Kalinin, and she quoted from it to all who had wished or were forced to listen, quote, "My long sentence has not broken my will in the struggle for the Soviet government, for Soviet industry." Meanwhile, when Akimov had come and reported to her that the thieves refused to obey him, she herself did not go to explain to this socially friendly element that their conduct was harming industry, but she pulled him up short. "You have to compel them. That's why you were appointed." Akimov was beaten up, and she made no effort to struggle further, but merely wrote the camp, "Do not send us that contingent anymore." She also accepted very calmly the fact that in her factory young girls worked 8 hours straight at automatic machines. They were confined uninterruptedly for the whole 8-hour period to autonomous motions of the conveyor belt. She said, "There is nothing to be done. They are more important sectors than that for mechanization." The day before, Saturday, there had been a rumor going the rounds that they would again not give us our Sunday off. And that's exactly what happened. The young girls at the automatic machines clustered around her and said to her bitterly, "Olga Petrovna, are you really going to take our Sundays away from us again? After all, this is the third in a row. Sunday. The war's over." Wearing her red scarf, she indignantly tossed her dark profile, which wasn't a woman's nor a man's either. "Girls, what right do we have to a Sunday? The construction project in Moscow is being held up because there are no bricks." In other words, of course, she didn't know anything about the particular construction project or which bricks were being sent, but in her mind's eye she could see that a big generalized construction project. And here were these young girls so vile as to want to wash their things. It was necessary to Matronina in order to double the number of cars of clay in one shift. She took no account of the strength of the sloggers, the condition of the cars, or the capacity of the pressing plant, but merely demanded that it be doubled. And how could an outsider unacquainted with the setup double the number of carloads except with his fist? I did not double the output, and by and large, the output did not change one earload under me, and Matronina was merciless, scolded me in Barov's presence and that of the workers, without being able to get through her woman's head that which of the least sergeant to get through her woman's head that which of the least sergeant knows that one must not dress down even a corporal in the presence of a private, and then on one occasion admitting my total defeat in the clay pit, and therefore my incapacity to direct, I went to Matronina and, as gently as I could, asked her, "Olga Petrovna, I'm a good mathematician. I do figures quickly. I've heard that you need an accountant in the plant. Take me." "An accountant," she raged, and her cruel face grew even darker, and the ends of her red scarf wound around the back of her head. "I'll put any wisp of a girl to work as an accountant, but what we are commanders of production, how many loads Are you short for your shift? Be off with you. And like a new Pallas Athena, with outstretched arm she sent me back to the clay pit. And a day later the position of foreman of the clay pit was abolished, and I was fired. Not just straightforwardly, but vengefully. Matronina summoned Baranov and gave him his orders. Put him to work with a crowbar and don't take your eyes off him. Make him load 6 cars a shift. Make him sweat. And right then, in my officer's uniform, in which I had so much pride, I went forth to dig clay. Baranov was overjoyed. He had foreseen my fall. If I had better understood the secret, alert connection between all camp events, I could have guessed at my fate the day before. In the Novi Jerusalem mess hall, there was a separate serving window for the ITR's engineering technical workers, from which the engineers, bookkeepers, and shoemakers received their medals. After my appointment as foreman on the clay pit, catching on to the camp grass-pit thing, I had approached this window and demanded my meal. The cooks dragged their feet about, saying I wasn't on the list of ITRs, but nonetheless they did each issue me my meal, and even without protesting after a while, so that I myself came to believe that I was on their list. As I thought it over later, I was, for the kitchen, still a question mark. Hardly had I arrived that I acted big. I had borne myself proudly and gone about in military uniform. Such a person might very easily in a week become a senior work assigner, or the senior camp bookkeeper, or a doctor. In camp, everything is possible. And then, they would be in my hands. So even though, in actual fact, the plant was only trying me out and had not included me on any list at all, the kitchen kept on feeding me just in case. But one day before my fall, when even the plant didn't know, the camp kitchen already knew all about it and slammed the door in my mug. I had turned out to be a cheap sucker. This tiny episode typifies the atmosphere of the camp world. This so prevalent human desire to be set apart by clothes discloses in us, in fact, particularly to the keen eyes of camp. It seems to us that we're clothing ourselves, but in fact we're burying ourselves, and we're showing what we're worth. I did not understand that my military uniform had the same price as Matronina's red scarf, but there was an unslumbering eye which had spied it all out from a hiding place, and one day an orderly was sent to get me. A lieutenant wanted to see me over here in a separate room. The young lieutenant conversed with me very pleasantly in the cozy, clean room. He and I were alone. The sun was shining just before sinking in the west, and the wind was blowing the curtain. He told me to be seated. For some reason he asked me to write my autobiography, and he could not have made a more pleasant proposal after the protocols of interrogation in which I had only spat on myself, after the humiliation of the Black Marias and the transit prisons, after the convoy and prison jailers, after the thieves and the trustees who had refused to see in me a former captain of our glorious Red Army. Here I sat behind a desk, and without being pushed by anyone at all, beneath the benign glance of a friendly lieutenant, I wrote in just the right length, in thick ink, on an excellent smooth paper, which did not exist in camp, that I had been captain, and I commanded a battery, that I had been awarded some decorations, and thanks to the actual writing, it seemed that I had regained my own personality, my own I. Yes, my gnoseological subject, I. And yet I was, after all, a university man, a civilian in the army by chance. Imagine how embedded it must be in a career officer. This insistence on being held in esteem, and the lieutenant on reading my biography was quite satisfied with it. So you are a Soviet person, right? Well, to be sure. Well, of course, why not? How pleasant it was to rise again from the mud and ashes, and once again to become a Soviet person. It was one half of freedom. The lieutenant asked me to come see him in 5 days. During these 5 days, I wondered. I was forced to say goodbye to my military uniform because it was bad to be digging clay in it. I hid my camp field shirt and my military breeches in my suitcase. And at the camp storage room, I received some patched and faded rag, which appeared to have been washed after lying for a year in the trash bin. It was an important step, though. I did not yet recognize its significance. My soul had not yet become that of a Zek, but my skin therewith became a Zek's. With a shaven head, tormented by hunger and squeezed by enemies, I would soon acquire the glance of a Zek too, insincere, suspicious, all-observant. This was how I looked when, in 5 days' time, I went to see the security chief, still not understanding what he was getting at, but the security chief was not there. He had stopped coming there entirely. He already knew, but we did not, that in another week we would all be dispersed, and that they would begin bringing Germans to Nova Jerusalem to replace us, and that is how I missed seeing the lieutenant. I discussed with Gamarov and Engel why it was that I had wrote my autobiography, and we did not guess, innocent, that these were already the first claws of the beast of prey reaching in our nest. And yet, meanwhile, the picture was so clear. 3 young men had arrived in the new prisoner transport, and they kept discussing something all the time, arguing among themselves, and one of them, swarthy, round, and gloomy, with his little mustaches, the one who had gotten himself a place in the bookkeeping office, didn't sleep nights and kept writing something on the bunks, writing and hiding it. Of course, one could send someone and grab what he was hiding, but without causing an alarm, it was simpler to find out about it from the one of them who wrote Army Bridges. He evidently was an army man and a Soviet person, and he would assist in the spiritual surveillance. Zhora Engel, who was not exhausted by his work during the day, really did refuse to sleep the first half nights, and thus defended the freedom of creative spirit. He sat upon the upper panel of the multiple bunk without mattress, pillow, or upper panel of the multiple bunk without mattress, pillow, or blanket in its padded jacket. It was not warm in the rooms. For the nights were autumn nights. His shoes, his feet stretched out on the panel, his back leaning against the wall and sucking on his pencil, looked sternly at his sheet of paper. One could not have dreamed up worse behavior in camp, but neither he nor we yet understood how all that stood out like sore thumb and how they kept watch over such things. Sometimes he simply gave in to his frailties and wrote an ordinary letter. His 23-year-old wife had not yet worn out the shoes in which she'd gone with him that winter to the conservatory, and now she had left him. Security questionnaires, a blot on one's record, yes, and a person wants to live. He wrote to another woman who he called a dear sister, concealing from himself and from her that he also loved her, or was ready to love her. But that woman too soon got married. He could write like this: "My dear little sister, hearken to the wonderful imitations of humanity, Handel, Tchaikovsky, Debussy, I too wanted to become an imitation, but the clock of my life has come to a stop. Or simply, you have become much closer to me during the course of these months. It has become clear that there are very many real, genuine people in the world, and I must hope that your husband would also be a real human being. Or like this, I have wandered through life, stumbling and in search of myself. There is a bright light in the room, and I have never seen darkness that is blacker. But only here I have found myself and my own fate, and this time not in books either. And do you know, my little bird, I have never been such an optimist as I am now. Right now. Now I know once and for all that all there is nothing more precious in life than the idea one serves. And I also now know how and what I must write. That's the main thing. And for the time being, he wrote that night and hid during the day a story about El Campesino, a Spanish Republican with whom he had shared a cell and whose peasant common sense had delighted him. El Campesino's fate was a simple one. After having lost the war to Franco's, he came up here to the Soviet Union, and after a while he was imprisoned here. Engel was not a warm person. He did not inspire one to open up one's heart to him at the first impulse. I've just written this and stopped to think. Was I called a warm person either? But his steadfastness was a worthy model to write in camp. I might someday be able to rise to it if I didn't perish. But for the time, someday, be able to rise. But for the time being, I was tormented by my own restless search, depressed by my first days as a clay digger. On a serene September evening, Boris Gamarov and I could find time only to sit a while on a pile of cinders and at the approach of the camp perimeter. In the direction of Moscow, 37 miles away, the heavens flamed with salutes. This was the holiday victory over Japan. But the lanterns of our camp compound burned with a dull, tired light. A hostile reddish light emanated from the plant windows, and in a long drawn-out string, as mysterious as the years and the months of our prison term, the lanterns on the poles of the broad brickyard compound receded into the distance. Arms around his knees, thin and coughing, Gamarov repeated, "For 30 years I have nurtured my love for my native land, and I shall neither expect your leniency nor desire it." I got taped up right there. Thank you for listening.